Would like to welcome Mike Mierzwa, the State Floodplain Manager for the California Department of Water Resources, here to talk about the Headwaters to Floodplains Flood Safety Partnership.
Well, howdy, everybody. My name's Mike Mierzwa. I want to start off just a little bit of background about myself. I've been with the Department of Water Resources doing water management as a civil engineer for over 20 years now. I've had a background in modeling, planning, emergency response, in a number of areas of water management across the state. And really, my expertise is in coordination and collaboration with federal, state, and local agencies. But before we begin to talk about Headwaters floodplains this afternoon, I first wanted to just welcome everybody. If you haven't already been, welcome to the California Flood Preparedness Week, which is this week here in California. We're reminding everybody about the dangers of flooding and the things they can do to prepare themselves. And I also would like to wish good luck to Garrett Cole tonight at 5 p.m. in game number 1 for the World Series. So with that, we'll go on to my first slide here in the Headwaters Floodplains Flood Safety Partnership. What you're looking at here is a graphic of the 10 hydrologic regions across the state of California. And surrounding these hydrologic regions, you see examples of typical flood hazard types. Most of California's hydrologic regions are exposed to multiple flood hazard types within each hydrologic region. However, the mitigation measures that we use to manage these floods are often designed to address specific flood hazard types. Obviously, the types of flood hazards that we experience the most we're going to bias most of our mitigation measures for. However, lessons learned in one part of the state can benefit communities in other parts of the state. This is particularly important in face of climate change and growing exposure to the population growth out there, that hazards that we're not used to seeing may in the future become more and more common. And you'll see in this slide that I've focused in on the word exposed, flood hazards, and mitigation measures. This is a lot of the lingo that we often promote and have discussions about in H2F. It's really about managing our flood risks to reduce exposure and to reduce the consequences of flooding. Go to the next slide there. The H2F, our Headwaters to Floodplains Flood Safety Partnership, is based off of a lot of previous work from many agencies, which we're looking at as a cover of the California Flood Future Report, which was released in November 2013. And in that report, the Department of Water Resources, in coordination with the Army Corps of Engineers, had dialogue with over 100 different flood management agencies across the state of California. We later, at DWR alone, went and updated and talked to an additional 100 water management agencies to collect what is the first modern assessment of statewide flood risk, not flood risk at one locale, but across the state. And the map you're seeing of California is a map depicting the 100, the 500-year floodplains. Very hard to see, but there are little dots of all of the dams that are sitting in California, along with red lines indicating the over 14,000 miles of levees that we reuse in the state of California to structurally manage our flood risk out there. But the Flood Future Report also talked a lot about non-structural actions and the value of engagement, some of the earlier recommendations in that report. So why is it important for us to engage on flood management? If you look at the next slide, 2017 is still a recent memory for many of us here in California. Flooding is not a localized issue, but actually a statewide issue or problem that has local impacts. All I want you to take away from this slide is that in 2017, large and significant flood events were experienced across the entire state. A lot of people here in Sacramento were focused on what was happening here in Northern California. However, as you can see from this graphic, Southern California experienced similar drastic flooding extents. Just some highlights out there. In 2017, the State Flood Operations Center set a new record where we were operating for over 144 consecutive days. That's not normal, but one of the keys of that operation is the engagement and coordination in our emergency response. I just wanted to remind everybody for our Headwaters to Floodplains effort here that we are taking the same statewide focus or lens. Move to the next slide. What we're talking about doing in any flood management activity is buying down risk. This stair-step graphic is something that is based off of a concept the Army Corps of Engineers promoted several decades ago, which is that as you go through and invest in both structural and non-structural actions, you'll buy down your risk. You'll look that the risk level is represented by the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal plane of this graphic, you'll see that you start off with assessing your risk. Is before you can go through and manage your risk, you have to have some sense of what that risk is. Then you go through a series of planning and preparedness activities that lead to both structural and non-structural actions and investments to buy down that risk, leaving you with some residual risk that always exists at the end of your actions out there. I'm going to revisit this slide in a few minutes. And the next slide, what I wanted to point out is we're looking at a graphic here on the right of a watershed. And these are typical watersheds in California where we have a short distance from a mountainous area to a floodplain and then eventually out to a coastal area. Within this floodplain, you'll see that we've marked off the upper watershed, a dam feature out there, recharge areas, levee channel structures, communities, and an agriculture. And the reality is that the challenges and opportunities that exist within these watersheds, when we think of them as moving beyond protecting a single asset and considering an entire watershed, we really are giving birth to where we came up with the name Headwaters to Floodplains. And it is our approach to recognizing that outside of your normal jurisdiction, there are challenges and opportunities that together we can explore to get a more resilient flood management system. We move on to the next slide, the Headwaters to Floodplains. It is a collaborative partnership among public agencies with the goal of reducing California's exposure to flood risk and reducing the consequences of flooding. If you move on to the next slide, we talk in the H2F partnership about three cornerstones: the cornerstone of engagement, the cornerstone of technical assistance, and a cornerstone of funding opportunities. And the reason we chose this word cornerstones is a cornerstone is the first stone you lay down for actually constructing a foundation for any building. And while we're really talking about non-structural solutions, we are protecting physical assets out there. But the cornerstones are intended to be building blocks really to improve the capacity for these agencies responsible for flood management to be better prepared for a changing environment and changing population needs for managing floodwaters. So if you go on to the next slide, I'm revisiting the stair-step graphic out here, and I've put a little star next to some of the activities that would really be the focus of what we're doing in the Headwaters Floodplains effort. First, risk assessments. By sharing risk assessments and getting that information out there both to the public land use decision makers, to the legislature, to members of the public, we can better prepare for flood management. Emergency management planning is a core component of that, and in emergency management, the more players you have through exercises, when you get to an emergency, you've established a connection where you can implement that. Floodplain management, land use planning, which includes zoning, building codes, retreating from areas that are at risk of flooding, we call it relocating, land acquisition and easements, as well as development of risk-based tools is another core area where we can share information and best lessons. Insurance is something that individuals can do to protect themselves so they can have a quicker recovery when flooding occurs. And then reservoir and floodplain storage operations. These are things that lessons learned in one area can help another. Also, when you're going through coordinating the operations of multiple reservoirs can allow one reservoir to minimize the loss of water on what would be a filling or storage event, while the other reservoir might be able to go through and evacuate water if it's impacted by a flood event. So there's value to be gained through coordination on that. And then finally, there always is a flood risk, and we will manage that residual risk. But through the Headwaters to Floodplains Flood Safety Partnership, we can work together so that when we're going in both the response and recovery modes of emergency, that we'll have connections, we'll have understanding of what those risks are, and what the roles each of the agencies can provide and the resources they can provide to each other. So we hope to actually address that through our partnership. So on the next slide, I've talked about some core principles of the Headwaters Floodplains Partnership. And really what I've done, and I don't like to do this, is I talked about what H2F is not replacing, because a lot of people see this as yet another effort or another engagement when they're taxed out there. But I've listed out what the value of participation actually is through partnering with other agencies. First, it's really about direct engagement. It's not about direct engagement with the public. There will be some of those activities out there, but the members of our partnership are actually flood public agencies. The value is that we provide a venue for frequent and informal coordination where we can go through and understand each other better. H2F is not going to replace the disagreements between agencies. It will provide a safe place to have conceptual discussions and to learn from both successes and failures. And I think there's as much value in learning about a failure as there is in a success. An example of that is California's dam safety program was created after the St. Francis Dam failure. Having discussions about what that is and where we move forward is the point of our partnership. H2F is not about going and replacing existing policies or administrative procedures. However, it provides an opportunity to explore new ways to implement existing policies and discuss possible policy changes. An example of this is communities here in Northern California have been working with FEMA, the Flood Emergency Management Agency, about administrative interpretations of how they could go through and enact some of their provisions in a way to address the flood risk within agricultural areas. Those types of things are what I'm talking about here. H2F is not replacing existing funding decision processes. However, H2F will inform funding decisions and promote a shared interest in funding assistance programs, aka as we go through and talk about what the need for future flood investments are, hopefully we can generate support for continuing those programs. H2F is not about going and replacing existing agency roles and responsibilities. And the member agencies of H2F, they could be regulators, they could be implementers, they could be operators, such as a reservoir operator, or they could be maintainers, such as an agency responsible for maintaining a levee. What the value of participation is it facilitates the capacity growth for these participating agencies through three concepts, and these really are another way to think of our cornerstones, which is shared innovations, shared experiences, and collaboration, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. H2F is not replacing the review processes or the internal policies of participating agencies. So by participating in H2F, you're not giving away any of your sovereignty. What you are doing is you're increasing your understanding of other member agencies' internal processes, which means when you're having discussions with those agencies, you can understand the process and the time it takes and the level of effort for them to go through and enact information. So you'll know when it is most appropriate for you to time specific keyed engagement in your discussions. And H2F is not replacing the chain of command or authorities. It just allows us to have increased alignment of those authorities. Where there are two agencies that have overlapping authorities, by going and having an informal venue where you can talk about how you implement your authorities, you might be able to enter into other agreements or shared collaboration and leverage work of those other agencies. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to walk through our three cornerstones. Technical assistance. This is really about sharing innovations. Some examples of that is creating or sharing technical tools that we use to improve our flood risk awareness, making those technical tools readily accessible to stakeholders, enhancing the local agency capacity and capabilities, and expanding weather monitoring, gauging, notifications. And within the technical area cornerstone, some of the example projects that we hope to work on as a group is installing new gauges, designing and improving and sharing models, actually advocating for projects and talking about how those projects effectively reduce risk, sharing data, looking at forecasts, actually facilitating emergency exercises, going through and conducting exposure assessments, and of course, one of my personal favorites is going through and understanding and engaging in the development of mapping products, be it dam inundation maps and floodplain exposure maps. The next cornerstone we have out here are our funding opportunities. This is really about sharing experiences. One of the things that we have the ability to go through and do is maintain and update the inventory of flood mitigation projects. And I'm talking about looking at local hazard mitigation plans, looking at the projects identified in the state hazard mitigation plan. This also involves coordination with California's integrated regional water management plans. So I think there's a typo in my slide there. And also looking at the state's sustainable groundwater management plans. Within these regional planning efforts, there are identified number of projects that could be reshaped and could provide flood mitigation, or those projects are actually right now eligible for flood mitigation. We had the opportunity to report on the statewide investment need. This was something that came out of the California Flood Future Report, as well as promoting and reporting on the implementation and progress in implementation of our mitigation measures. These are code for projects. We also have the opportunity to promote cost-effective floodplain management mitigation measures. Often we focus in on a lot of these structural projects, but FEMA has talked about the value in mitigation dollars spent is that you save, where you get $6 in return for every dollar of investment that you spend in mitigation. And this could be elevating structures, relocating structures, floodproofing the structures. Public awareness campaigns could fit in here as well. And some example projects is we hope to develop a financial assistance clearinghouse where at the local level, agencies could understand the timing of when there are going to be financial assistance programs, when is the right time to apply, what is scheduled to come out next, what are the general guidelines in those projects, and where can you provide comments. We would like to go through and provide guides highlighting and illustrating successful grant applications, learning from the success of other applicants of how you can put together a better proposal. We're all interested in actually getting projects implemented, and the best way to do that is to see how people have successful been able to do that. And then updating and reviewing exposure information and supporting our loss avoidance studies. These are often critical requirements to develop a benefit cost ratio or a value statement within your application for a grant program. And so a lot of the linkage in our funding opportunities goes back to the technical assistance. And finally, getting into our third cornerstone, which is really about collaboration, is we'd like to build or improve the collaboration within and between agencies. We'd like to facilitate consistent messaging about flood risk and emergency preparedness so that different agencies are using the same basic terminology so the public will begin to understand the importance of flood management. We'd like to highlight success stories. I'm talking about not just projects, but research efforts and our recovery efforts. How fast have we been able to recover from flooding? And then finally, we'd like to strengthen the collaboration between dam owners and the downstream communities. Some example projects that come out of engagement is there will be a very simple web page where you can learn about H2F that we're in development. It's really through our partner meetings where a lot of the informal conversations occur. There'll be email newsletters where information that could be coming through any of the partners can be shared with the other partners. Presentations like this presentation today, but more focused in on the technical and funding opportunity topics that I talked about before. And then, of course, information materials. So some of our next steps, we are going through and looking at data and information gathering. This is where we're pouring through the local hazard mitigation plans to see what's out there right now. We talk about needs assessments. This third bullet point here, building a resource portal. A portal is a doorway in the most simple sense. And what we're talking about, a portal here, is a way that instead of going through and have to hunt through multiple agencies' web pages, that the information that people need the most often could be put on a shared portal or resource. And then that would then point you to these other resources. It basically means for those of us that are newer to the flood risk management world that you could start at this portal and then hopefully in your discovery learn and get familiar with a lot of the existing resources that are out there. Design technical assistance offerings, and this is literally that we would design or build the technical assistance offerings. Specifically where we would have skills and classes to teach people to better understand flood risk, how to do the mapping, how to go through and do grant applications. And then the last bullet is identifying the funding opportunities. So for the group that we have together here right now, we're already starting to talk about how we can start building that portal to point to a clearinghouse for the funding opportunities. So that's sort of what we're talking about for next steps. The timing of that is it'll take us months to work through that. But I wanted to talk about where we've been recently and sharing and getting people interested in the Headwaters Floodplains Flood Safety Partnership. And on September 5th of this year at the Floodplain Management Association annual conference down in San Diego, there was a panel discussion. And I was facilitating a panel, and I had Gregor Blackburn from FEMA Region 9. I had John Kane from River Partners, who is also a local levee maintainer now in his role at River Partners. I had Brent Seamer from Simi Valley, a floodplain manager of the year there. John Kane was 3 years ago. And then finally, I also had Jose Laura from the California Office of Emergency Services from their Dam Safety Program all speak on the panel. And as we spoke about what managing flood risk was to us and the value of engagement, we handed out comment cards, and I'm going to share one with you right now to all of the participants. And literally what we had asked everybody to do is based off of the questions that I was asking of the panelists, getting back to our core cornerstones of engagement, technical assistance, and funding assistance. We asked everyone to provide some of their feedback for us that we shared with the H2F steering team to help us develop our work plan, help us actually refine what our next steps were. And I wanted to share one of the responses of one of those cards with you. So what you're looking at now is we have protected the innocent somewhat here, where we've hidden their name and their organization, their email, but I wanted to share with you what their comments were. In this case, this participant pointed out that they're the community rating system coordinator for their community. And if you look at the bottom, they say that they're interested in the Carmel River floodplains. So maybe we're not doing the best job as a witness protection program. However, they wanted to go through and update their community's floodplain management plan, which I'm assuming is the floodplain management and the flood element within their local hazard mitigation plan. And they are interested in talking to the members that are participating in the Headwaters floodplain issue to do that. I really particularly liked their request or their comment on technical assistance. They said, yes, they'd like it. We'd like to offer it too. So this is, we obviously have their contact information. And so as we go out and work on work products, we hope to use through the engagement and email blasts is to give local agencies, state agencies, federal agencies the opportunity to weigh in on what they're seeing as we're formulating what the projects would look like. So before we have any sunk costs in our projects, we might have the opportunity to modify them to where we can meet the needs of more entities. So with that, I'm going to close out here with a view of the questions again in these cards. What I'd like to ask each of you to do is this video broadcast will be recorded and available on YouTube. You will be able to go back and pause your recording on this particular slide here, where you look at our question on engagement, our question on technical assistance, and our question on funding assistance. And literally, I'd like each of you, if you have the time, to either in the chat here today, ask some questions where we can engage on that. But more important than that is email us what some of your thoughts are on here based on what I've talked about for our partnership and how you might be able to help inform us what our priorities should be. So with that, we're going to go to the last slide. I have Kelly Soleil, one of my engineers here. She is California's National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator, and she's within our Office of Floodplain Management here. I have her email here, but you can also email comments and questions to simple h2f@water.ca.gov. That is an alias where the entire team here will be able to see and look at your response to our comments based off of anything I've said today. And hopefully you'll be able to go through and give us some thoughts on what should this partnership be doing, focusing on engagement, technical assistance, and funding opportunities.